and welcome to Brewed Awakening, serving fair trade coffee, tea, and speakers to stir the social conscience. Amen. So that's what we want to do tonight. We want to stir social conscience. So we're kind of interested. I want to say a special welcome to those who come from off campus, who are not students or faculty or staff here. Can you kind of raise your hand? Special welcome. And who else is in the house here? We have some graduate students in the house here. Graduate students, MBA students up here, a couple others. How about what other majors do we have here? What other departments do we have represented here? Business. Who's all business here? Let's see some hands.
I'm all business.
Right. It's all business, right? How about sociology? Sociology here? Yeah. All right. Who else? English? Lit? Journalism? Communication? What else? Nursing? Who's nursing in the house? Nursing's in the house. All right. Who else is psychology? Psychology? All right. Psychology's in the house. Who else are we missing? Who are we missing? Biology. How about the sciences? So let's just go over generally the sciences. So the sciences in the house. All right. All right. How about I guess that would include math, huh? Any good? Okay. Who are we missing? History of political science? History of poli-sci. All right. This is your building, right? So thank you for letting us use your building. All right. Who did we miss? Did we miss anybody? The arts. The arts. Oh, a little bit. What do we got? Arts. We got drama. We got. Okay. Excellent. Excellent. Well, welcome everyone. As you know, I'm Jamie Gates, and I'm the director of the Center for Justice and Reconciliation. And the Brewed Awakening program is a program of the Center for Justice and Reconciliation. Its mission is to teach poverty and oppression. To study poverty and oppression. I'll get this right. Like running through my head. Which story do I need to tell you? What is it? What is it that we do here, Harry? Can you tell me what it is we do here?
I have a clue.
To study poverty and oppression and to teach Christian means of social engagement. So we do that through study abroad programs like to South Africa this summer or Urban Term next summer in City Heights. We do that through the Brewed Awakening program. We do that through all kinds of networking in the city, all kinds of internships. And tonight I wanted to just highlight a few of the interns and the internships. I'm going to let some of the CJR interns introduce themselves, tell them about their passions, and they're going to invite you to get and stay involved. And I know we're coming close to exams and all. We're talking about for the long haul here. So Marissa, you want to start?
Sure, I guess so. Okay. Hey, everybody. My name is Marissa, and I'm interning with Jamie, and Bella and I do it together, and it's called the Sabbath Economics Internship. And so that's what we're talking about tonight. So you guys should talk to us about stuff that you want to do. I don't know. So what does that mean? It's hard to answer because it means a lot of different things. We've been talking about how broad it is, but it's like anything to do with like money, where it comes from, where it's going, and how to deal with it in like an ethical kind of way. And so that's fair trade stuff, that's food justice stuff, that's worker justice stuff, it's consumerism, that's what everything. So it's just like everything you can think of, I guess, and we're going to learn more about it tonight, so hopefully you'll have a better idea of that in your head. So I rambled enough. We are getting together on Thursday to have a meeting, so if you guys feel riled or passionate or interested or curious or anything about any of this stuff we're talking about today or over the week, please come to the rec room at 3 o'clock on Thursday. It'll be awesome people and stuff, so be there. And we have like sign-up sheets going around and outside, so we get your email, bother you with emails. It'll be great. We'll be good friends. Okay, thank you.
My name is Bella, and I'm also part of the Sabbath Economics internship. And one of the other things that we're focusing on for the following year is how we can relate Sabbath Economics to our community and our Point Loma bubble, and just looking at choices that we make here on campus. And I think one of the things that we're going to be talking about in the chapel tomorrow, many of you have probably seen this, but the 7 questions that were featured in the Point Weekly, they're going to be addressed tomorrow. So if you guys have questions about those questions or responses, you can tweet them to the PLNU Romanian Business Institute. The website there should be some going around. There's a couple on the back corners over there, and you can log on to the blog. that features the questions. So that'll be answered tomorrow in chapel. Another thing.
Sure. I already talked a lot. Okay, anyway, in the fall, we have the Roots of Giving Fair, which is tons of cool stuff involving all those things that you heard about earlier, where we work on stuff. We have people from outside the community, people from our, inside the university, everything all coming together, and we have this really cool, like, fair trade fair thing that just is all kinds of alternative ways to do Christmas. And so that's really cool. So we'll kind of be, like, working on that and getting, hopefully be like brainstorming, not even just like seeing who's interested, who wants to do stuff for next semester. So kind of looking forward.
Hello, my name is David Mckibben. I intern on the issues of immigration, and I lead a discussion, or guide a discussion, every Thursday. We meet in the CAF from 5:30 to 6:30, and we talk about different immigration issues. The life of the migrant here in San Diego, and we were actually talking today about how all the different injustice issues kind of overlap, and how economy can influence and is, tied into the story of the migrant and their lifestyle and what they have to go through, and different things like that, food injustices. And so Thursday, if anyone's interested, we gather and we just talk and discuss these issues from different perspectives, and you're all welcome to come and join us. So,
we also have internships in human trafficking. If you haven't met Haley Swan, she's amazing, and they meet on Wednesday nights at 6 o'clock in the cafeteria. If human trafficking, if your consciousness has been piqued about human trafficking, they call themselves Beauty for Ashes. It's an amazing group. And then also in Christian peacemaking. So there's come talk to me if you're interested in internships for next year. I will also say that if you're interested in digging deeper academically, the CJR co-sponsors and co-hosts the Sustainability Minor. Professor Harry Watkins here, Dr. Harry Watkins, just kind of wave at everybody here. If you're interested in sort of how to begin to implement or think about the kind of things we're talking about tonight in your coursework, Professor Harry Watkins has a great way through the Sustainability Minor, so wanted to mention that as well. Welcome again tonight. Don't want to overwhelm you with too much and too many announcements because we have a tremendous speaker. Thank you for the three of you and the work that you're doing. I'm going to send around this sign-up sheet if you're interested just generally, or if you're interested in something specific that you heard about tonight. You can mark that here, give us your email, and we'll contact you for more to send around more information for you. But now, we've talked long enough, and I'm really, really blessed and privileged to have Ched Myers here tonight. Ched and I got to know each other. We met each other down at the border, doing some subversive activities there, an event called the La Posada Sin Fronteras, the Inn Without Borders, where we gather as Christians at Christmas time on both sides of the border and have this big worship service, and we mourn those who died crossing the border. We also celebrate Christian hospitality and try and figure out what that means given the scar in between us. And so that was my first encounter with Ched, and then I started reading his stuff. And I was just blown away that somebody would think so deeply and richly as a biblical scholar about politics and the economics of exploitation. And I quickly learned from him that, well, frankly, our tradition has been talking about these things for a very, very long time. And so Ched's come to share with us tonight some of the thoughts that God's laid on his heart. And so would you welcome him in the way that Point Loma welcomes good people.
Well, I am very grateful for Brother Jamie to extend the invitation and to make it happen for me to come and spend the last 2 days on campus, and for the intrepid interns who have helped along this way. And I do hope that you will avail yourself of this really remarkable center here for justice and reconciliation. It's really one of the pioneers when you look at colleges around the country. So don't not check it out while you're here, no matter whether you're a freshman or a senior or a grad student. And I also want to thank you all for coming. out on this Tuesday night. This is a great series, the Brewed Awakening series, and I'm very honored to be part of it. I think this is the last one of the year, right? So, how many of you have attended previous? No, let's do it differently. How many of you? This is your first time to Brewed Awakening. That's great. Give yourselves a round of applause. Seems to be one of the best things happening on campus here, as far as I can tell. This is not my native habitat. I'm not in academia. I'm a popular educator and activist, trying to build capacity for faith-based social justice movements between the seminaries, the sanctuaries, and the streets. And so it's fun for me every once in a while to come onto campus, see what's bumping, see what the interests are. And it's been a real delight for me over these last 48 hours. I'm out of here first thing at dark 30 tomorrow. I'm taking the train north to Ventura County, where I live and work. Here's what tonight is not going to be. It's not going to be sort of sloganeering or big broad brush economic justice rant or macro social analysis. There are a lot of people out there doing good stuff besides some of the people here on campus. You know, you can go to people like Shane Claiborne or Brian McLaren or Jim Wallace or others to get that sort of thing. My piece of the work is in terms of building, as we like to put it in our shop, trying to renew the church as a movement for social justice and to inhabit social justice movements as church. My piece of that really is very specific, and that is to try to continue to investigate the biblical underpinnings of work for justice and compassion and peace and reconciliation. So what I'm going to offer you tonight is part of a project that I've been involved in for almost 20 years now, of trying to read the Bible economically in order that we can read the economy biblically. That's sort of the short version of what it is that I'm trying to do. And I hope this connects with some of your interests. It's an attempt to take a core sample of our primal texts of faith and see what they have to tell us about the ongoing work of faith and justice. So some of you heard the rant in chapel, and now you're here for extra credit, and I'm really glad that you're interested enough to come along. And I do hope that while you're here, during your career in college or graduate school, that you will be infected with the virus of God's dream of justice. It is something that invites us and challenges us to practice what Jews called tikkun olam, the healing of the world. And it is a prayer that Jamie and I passionately share, that the church would be front and center in these efforts here and all around the world. So let's jump into it. I'm somebody who thinks that the history of social movements is important in part because the history of our church is the history of a social movement. And last week, just 8 days ago, was the 43rd anniversary commemoration of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, the greatest prophet our country has ever seen, and that our church has ever produced, in my opinion. And it's also the 44th anniversary of the most important and consequential speech that Dr. King gave in his impressive life of 39 years. It's a speech that he gave at Riverside Church in New York City on April 4th, 1967. And the name of the speech is Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break the Silence. It's a speech you can find easily on the web, both in audio and in text. And I think it's one of the greatest, if not the single greatest, piece of public oratory in the history of the United States, with apologies to old Abe Lincoln over there and some of the others are on the walls here. It's an incredible piece of public discourse, of public theology, and of prophetic politics. In that speech, Dr. King, for the first time, publicly came out in opposition to the war in Indochina. And that's what also made it his most consequential speech. Now, Dr. King, at that time, had a great deal of achievement. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. He managed, as the titular head of the Civil Rights Movement, to achieve significant gains in desegregation and voting rights. There had been some significant structural change in the United States around American apartheid. And quite frankly, Dr. King could have just taken his honorary doctorate and become president of a foundation and called it a day. And there were plenty of people encouraging him to do that. But you see, Dr. King wasn't just a movement leader, and he wasn't just a political figure. He was a disciple of Jesus, and he couldn't let it go. He couldn't let the vision of beloved community that had fired his bones since he first came to Birmingham in 1955. He couldn't let that vision go, and so despite the fact that every single one of his lieutenants in the Civil Rights Movement said, Dr. King, whatever you do, don't speak out against the war. We've built a fine movement here. We've got a little traction in Washington. People are listening to us. We got some profile. Civil rights is a domestic issue. Don't go trotting off into international issues that you don't know nothing about. Just leave it alone, Dr. King. He couldn't leave it alone. So he came out against all the advice of his allies and spoke incredibly prophetically. This is, I think, the greatest single line of the speech, in which he says that American society is being held hostage by the three great triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism. Now, I wish I could tell you that 44 years later, this diagnosis does not still apply. But I just don't think that's true. I think we still, as a society, are hostage to these giant pathological triplets. And until and unless we wrestle them to the ground, or as folks in Palestine say, bring these things, bring people who follow these things to their senses, but not to their needs, then we're going to have a real tough future ahead, and so is the rest of the world. Now, it was a consequential speech because exactly 1 year later, almost to the hour, Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis. Exactly 1 year later, on April 4th, 1968. Now, there is a connection, friends. It was Washington and the powers that be could barely tolerate King as a civil rights leader, but once he started speaking out against the war, bringing his considerable moral authority to the anti-war movement, he had to go. It has now been proven in a court of law, in a trial that was held in 1999, that Dr. King was, in fact, the victim of a government conspiracy to end his life. One of the most underreported stories of the last 15 years. And it makes me think of the way he ended the Riverside speech. Now let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world. This is the calling of the children of God, and our human family waits eagerly for our response. Dr. King was a preacher. In many ways, he wrote his own epitaph in this speech, going into sacred territory. And that's the kind of courage and conviction I believe that we need. Now, it is of great irony that another April 4th commemoration needs to be talked about. So I want to talk about somebody else halfway across the world who is also a prophet of peacemaking and justice. Giuliano Mckibben is an extraordinary figure in Palestine. Born of a Jewish Zionist mother and a Palestinian Christian father, he rose to quite a career in Israeli movies and theater. But he was very troubled by the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. And so, at the inspiration of his mother, Arna, he co-founded a theater in the village of Jenin on the West Bank that was a theater workshop. It was doing drama therapy for people, particularly for children traumatized by the war. Children who couldn't sleep, who couldn't cry, who would become catatonic, were able finally to touch their emotions through the indirect methods of drama therapy. Freedom Theater started in Jenin in 2002 and was widely considered one of the most compassionate, healing, and prophetic peacemaking activities in a war that has claimed literally thousands and thousands of lives. This way of allowing traumatized people to express themselves through theater became known all around the world. 6 weeks ago today, I was sitting in Freedom Theater talking with Giuliano. I was so deeply impressed with what he was doing. He took us into the performance space. We met many of the students. This is all taking place in a Palestinian refugee camp where there's so much despair, so much violence, so much hopelessness. On April 4th, just 8 days ago, Giuliano was gunned down in front of Freedom Theater by a masked gunman. April 4th, why did it have to be April 4th? Why did it have to happen at all? And so, by way of giving honor where honor is due, I want to dedicate this evening and this great circle of Brewed Awakening Consciousness Raising to the memory of Giuliano and his work. May his spirit rest in peace. May his work continue. And may we all be inspired to become more serious about our discipleship of justice and peace. And in Giuliano's honor, I have up on the table there a vest, beautiful Palestinian embroidery, that we can remember this incredibly courageous Israeli Jew who sacrificed a lucrative career in film and television to work in a Palestinian refugee camp to try to bring healing and peace, and who now has become yet another victim of this awful war. Well, to the topic, with that being mindful of the real world that we live in. Some of you, probably not many of you, but a few of you will know of this book. This was a commentary on the Gospel according to Mark that I published about 22 years ago, in which I tried to look at the Gospel of Mark as a manifesto of radical Christian discipleship. And one of the aims of this book was to directly challenge two of the ways in which Scripture tends to be read. One is the traditional spiritualizing fashion, and the other is the way that turns the stories into sort of dogmatic, abstract truths, theological doctrines, and so on. And to do this, to read the Gospel in a way that recognized its narrative and literary character on one hand, and also recognized that it was a story that took place in a very real world, as real as Memphis in 1968 or Jenin in 2011. A world of violence and betrayal, a world of profound injustice, and marginal hope. I also wanted in this book to promote that, contrary to what evangelicals tend to push as the core of the Christian faith, namely decisionism, right? The whole point is to get folks to get saved, to invite Jesus into their heart, and then everything else is sort of gravy. On one hand, decisionism, or on the other hand, denominationalism, which is sort of the liberal wing of the church, which is just quite happy if anybody actually comes to church and supports the institution and fills the pews of those big brick and mortars. Neither decisionism nor denominationalism seem to me to be faithful to the text of Scripture. But the core narrative of discipleship is. And so what I want to do with you this evening is look at one of our primal narratives of the call to discipleship. The basic question of Christian discipleship in every age is, how do we follow Jesus? WWJD. But here's the problem. We can't answer the question, how do we follow Jesus, unless we know where Jesus is. Sort of simple logic. And the problem with that question is, with much, if not most, first world Christianity, Jesus doesn't actually inhabit the real world at all. Jesus' story seems to have taken place in Disneyland. And his prophetic witness and the consequences of it have become profoundly domesticated in our churches, right? So I like the way that Brian McLaren puts it. The popular and domesticated Jesus has become little more than a chrome-plated hood ornament on the guzzling Hummer of Western civilization. Tell us how you really feel, Brian. But the notion that Jesus is somewhere other than the real world, sort of floating in the ether, above the terrain that we struggle in, is in fact the oldest heresy in the Christian tradition. And the name of that heresy is Docetism. Docetism taught that if Jesus was really human, then he could not have actually been God. And if Jesus was really God, he could not have been actually human. This was concocted by people who just couldn't figure out how the infinite, omnipotent, omniscient God could inhabit the limited, partial, ambiguous flesh and the vicissitudes of history. It just didn't seem to fit. So the incarnation was a great heresy. And the Docetists were rightly rejected by the earliest church as heretics. The problem there is that the church won that battle and lost the war. Because most Christian churches today are functionally docetic. Which is why when you call your parents for your weekly, monthly, once a semester check-in, and you talk a little bit about what you've been studying with Jamie Gates, they hit the roof because you're mixing religion and politics, or you're talking too much about economics. And ours is a spiritual tradition, doesn't have anything to do with these things. That's Docetism. Whenever anybody tries to drive a wedge between how human beings organize their lives in real history and the gospel, that's Docetism. And that's why we have historically we've had such a hard time to enlist churches into struggles for social justice. Now, of course, these days, everybody in churches, white, black, and brown, says that they were down with Dr. King. Have you noticed that? We even have a national holiday. And we got the mayor's prayer breakfast. And we got a couple of boulevards named after the brother. Oh, everybody loves Dr. King now. Because he dead. When you start talking to folks and everybody says, yeah, I marched with Dr. King. And then you go back and you look at the old newsreels. And there just actually weren't that many people marching with Dr. King who said they were marching with Dr. King. It's like the old splinters of the true cross, man. There just can't be that many splinters floating around. So in every generation, the best way to combat the functional docetism of our churches is to take what some of us call a radical approach. That's a word that's largely out of fashion, but it's technically an excellent term because it simply means to return to the roots of our faith. To turn to the roots of our tradition on the one hand, and then to try to get to the roots of the problems of violence and injustice in our day and age. Not to settle for symptoms and band-aids, but to do the hard analysis to get to the roots so that we can actually change some of these things. So what we're going to do here is take a sounding out of the roots of our Christian faith, namely in our Gospels, and to specifically do that, to look at the story of Jesus of Nazareth as he, in his coming out party. John Dominic Crossan, in a really nice little book he wrote in 2007 called God and Empire, said it very succinctly. It was precisely and specifically by the shores of the Sea of Galilee that the radicality of Israel's God confronted the normalcy of Rome's civilization under Herod Antipas in the 20s of the first century of the Common Era. Do you see how specific that statement is? It's specific in place, it's specific in time, it's specific in its political mapping. That's part of the scandal of particularity of our tradition. That Jesus wasn't actually a big helium balloon on the Thanksgiving parade smiling down on all of us. He was actually a dude in a particular place and time. And if we want to follow him, we better know something about that place and time. So what I want to do is take a couple of core samples from Mark's Gospel, the first 2 chapters, because we don't need to take Crossan's word for it. Let's look at how the story reads when it's recontextualized in the real world of first century Roman Palestine. Not Disneyland, but the hard terrain of that world. Because it has a lot to say about the political, economic, and social practices of Jesus, and therefore about those who wish to follow Jesus. Are you with me so far? Is this making sense? All right. Now, there's a couple interesting things to note about Jesus of Nazareth. First one being, his last name seems to be Nazareth. Well, or at least that's where he's from. Now, that's sort of interesting. We're told that Jesus came from Nazareth up in the Galilee, so we know he's from north of Palestine. And Nazareth is an obscure village, was an obscure village. It's otherwise completely unattested in ancient literature. So if we didn't have the Bible, we wouldn't know nothing about Nazareth. And yet Mark emphasizes it throughout the story. No less than 5 times he labels Jesus from Nazareth. He really wants us to know that this homeboy is from Nowheresville. He's a country bumpkin. But there was one thing noteworthy about Nazareth, and that was it lay a mere 3 miles southwest of the city of Sepphoris, which you see just below Nazareth, circled on the map there. Now, Sepphoris, also known as Zipporai or Dios Caesarea, had been built a century before Jesus on that Greek city plan, and was later fortified by Herod the Great as the capital of Lower Galilee. It was complete with a theater and a royal palace. So I want you to understand that Nazareth was literally living in the shadow of the great Hellenistic imperial city of Galilee. That's significant. It's like peering over the hill here and seeing downtown San Diego or the naval shipyards. You know, that does something to your consciousness if you're paying attention. After Herod's death in 4 BCE, a major Judean insurrection broke out, right? You understand that Palestine was an occupied country, occupied by the Romans, and Herod the Great was, he was just sort of a Latin American dictator puppet of Rome, doing the bidding of Rome throughout Palestine. And he was very good at it, and he was brutal in suppressing his own people on Rome's behalf. Now, there was so much suppression that when Herod died, everybody threw a big party. And it was a riot. Everybody just started tearing stuff up. And one of the things that the rebels did is they went in and they sacked the city of Sepphoris. As they went in, they took possession of the royal armory, got a bunch of weapons, that's what guerrillas do, and ran for the hills and started an insurrection. Now this was in the year 6 of the Common Era. And if we're doing our math right in our Jesus timeline, Jesus would have been about 6 years old when this major military insurrection broke out 3 miles from his front door. Do you think that had any impact on you? Well, of course not if he's the helium balloon over the Thanksgiving parade, but if he's a human being who's seeing the smoke rising and watching the soldiers go by, you see, because it didn't take long for the empire to strike back, and sure enough, after this revolt by Judas, son of Ezekias, Varus, the Roman legate of Syria, marched down and completely destroyed the city of Sepphoris and sold all the Jewish citizens into slavery. Do you think that might have made an impact on Jesus' consciousness? Historian Richard Horsley relates how Herod Antipas, now so Herod the Great dies and his kingdom is divided up into 3 sons, one of whom is Herod Antipas, and so when you read in the New Testament about Herod, most times it's referring to Herod Antipas, because that's the Herod who was alive during the life of Jesus. Horsley relates how Antipas, once the city of Sepphoris had been razed, Antipas moves to rebuild it, and this time he's going to rebuild it as an even more thoroughly Romanized, modern administrative center. So his first act was to establish this center from which his security forces, his market inspectors, and his tax collectors could be easily dispatched to control the countryside. Sound like any banana republic you might be familiar with? The former regional capital of Sepphoris lay in ruins as a result of the uprising, so Antipas ordered that it be reconstructed with a palace, a treasury, archives, and a forum. And when it was completed, he brought in a new population of loyal functionaries and workers to replace the former inhabitants who had been killed by Varus's legions or sold off into slavery. And he called the new city Autocratoris, literally meaning belonging to the emperor. Okay, so here you are, you're Jesus, you're living in this little village of a few hundred people over on this hill, and in the distance, every day, you watch this brand new, gleaming imperial city being built that is going to even more efficiently project Roman power right through your front door, right trampling over your culture and dominating the economy that you're trying to survive in. Are you following me? I'm telling you that Jesus' earliest memories were of imperial oppression that was right in his line of vision, in the same way that you can see the hill just 3 miles away from modern-day Nazareth. But not only that, and here are pictured the ruins. I actually visited the ruins at Sepphoris a month ago when I was in Israel, and it's just amazing. This is a theater that was built by Herod Antipas, and it's sort of interesting, you know, ancient Jews, they didn't go to the theater. So you might think that modern Jews have a lot of influence in Hollywood because there's so many creative directors and movie stars and studio, but back in the day, Jews didn't go to theater because it was idolatrous, right? And yet there's a very technical term from the Roman theater that Jesus uses over and over and over in some of his rants. It's the term hypocrites, what we commonly call hypocrite. So for example, in Matthew 23, there's this litany, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Now he wasn't meaning hypocrites in the way that we mean it, meaning somebody who's disingenuous and duplicitous. He was meaning it in the technical term coming from the Roman theater, meaning actor. A hypocrite was an actor in the Roman theater. It was someone who was playing a part that was different than what they were supposed to be in real life. That's the nature of an actor. So it wasn't a compliment, but it was a different kind of indictment. So that suggests that, you know, that's one of the indirect evidences that suggests that we know that Jesus of Nazareth not only was aware of Sepphoris, but was aware of the pagan culture that was dominating his landscape. Now, there's more to say about the Roman presence on the land and the propaganda of Roman domination. I want to show you a dedication plaque here found in northern England. It's flanked by relief carvings. At the left is Mars, the Roman god of war, brandishing a spear, while at the right is the mythological hero Hercules holding his club. At the bottom is a running boar, symbol of the 20th Legion. Now, this is what you call the political propaganda of empire. This particular plaque was found in northern England. If you know anything about the reach of the Roman Empire, you realize this is at the very furthest margins of empire. You're walking along the road with your sheep, and you come across this plaque, and what's it telling you? It's telling you a story, and you're not the subject of this story. You're the subject of this empire. And it's telling you that you mess with Rome, and the gods in all their brutality will hammer on your head. Now, Judea, Palestine was also at the far outskirts of the Roman Empire, and the same kind of propaganda was being built all around the place, like billboards as Jesus is going to work, billboards that are talking about the omnipotence of Rome. Well, not only that, but let's say you got to go down to the corner store and buy milk and bacon. Okay, maybe not bacon. Here's the coin you get to use. These are coins that were issued right after the final Roman defeat of the Judean revolt that had started back in the year 6, that culminated in the year 70, and Rome came in and completely wiped out the Judean rebellion and issued this coin. And I want you to look at the iconography here. This is the Judea Captus series. Here is a Roman legionnaire standing victorious over a woman slumped over with her hands bound behind her under a palm tree, symbol of Palestine. This is what you got to buy groceries with. Every day a reminder that you are a defeated people. That's going to work on your head. It's going to do to you what oppression does to all people who live under it, which is to make you feel inferior, depressed, impotent. Because everywhere you look, you don't see your face, you see the face of empire. Everywhere you look at your political prospects, you only see the omnipotence of your oppressor. And not only that, here's another coin. This is a denarius that has a picture of Providentia, Providence, the goddess Providence, standing, holding a globe, symbol of the whole known world, in her hand. And around the edges of the coin, in Latin, the word Eternitas. The empire is forever. Think about that next time you read about eternal life in the New Testament. And imagine the argument that the early Christians were picking with the empire. Well, the political oppression of Herodian Galilee was further underlined by the fact that if Jesus grew up in the shadow of Sepphoris, and if during his lifetime Sepphoris was being rebuilt in the major construction project, and let's say you're Jesus, and let's say you're a tekton, a carpenter, a construction worker, where are you going to get work? You're going to get work rebuilding the city of your oppressors. It's sort of like being Chicano in the 1930s in San Diego, where your ancestors remember when this was part of Mexico, but now the only job you can get is in the naval shipyards, building the power of the country that took your country. Do you follow the analogy? It's going to do something to you. And I just want you to understand that this was the real world that Jesus was growing up in. Not only that, but here's a second marker that Mark's gospel gives us in verse 14, namely that Jesus' ministry begins at the precise point after John the Baptist was arrested by Herod, that is Antipas. We find out later in Mark chapter 6 that in a flashback account of John's execution, Mark explains the circumstances surrounding these events, making it clear that it was John's public criticisms of Herod's personal and political policies that got him thrown into prison and eventually killed. And of all people on the landscape, who does Jesus decide to apprentice himself with? That wild wilderness prophet John, who gets himself arrested. As soon as John goes down, Jesus' public ministry begins. In other words, he is following in the footsteps of John. It's a little bit like being a Christian in 1968. Let's say April 6th, 1968. And right after you're reading the news about King being assassinated, you come out publicly and say, I am a disciple of Dr. King. It's that sort of political controversy. Not too many Christians did that, by the way, in April 1968. Everybody was ducking and running for cover. Now, Mark further specifies Jesus' social location just a few verses later when he is portrayed as passing along the Sea of Galilee. But why would Jesus have moved some 60 miles from Nazareth in the interior hill country to the Sea of Galilee? Was he running for cover after John's arrest? Well, there are probably two reasons for Jesus' significant geographic move. Both of them economic. Remember, this story is not taking place in Disneyland. It's taking place in a real world. The first reason is that, well, obviously at the Sea of Galilee, the major industry was fishing, and fishing depends on boats constructed of wood. These boats were often in need of repair. A number of years ago, I think about 20 years ago, a boat was found at Kinnereth along the Sea of Galilee, and they've positively identified it from carbon dating to date to the early part of the 1st century, so they call it the Jesus boat. And when you do an analysis on the boat, you find that it was originally constructed of cedar, which was a very resistant wood, resistant to rot, but then repaired with no less than 5 other types of wood over the next century. In other words, this boat was being constantly patched because it was a boat used by peasant fishermen who were poor. So you're just doing whatever you can do to keep this leaky tub going so you can scratch out a living. And so Jesus might have gotten a job as a tecton, a carpenter, helping folk repair boats. The other possibility was, for why Jesus may have come to the Sea of Galilee, was that there was a major shift in Herodian construction projects. You see, beginning in the year 7, Sepphoris is being rebuilt into Autopratoris, and Jesus probably getting, and his daddy probably getting more rebuilding this Roman city. But then Antipas changes his mind because there's a major shift in the Mediterranean economy. And Roman policy, imperial policy, has decided that it wants to structurally adjust the political economy in and around the Sea of Galilee because there's a rich fishing industry, and fish can be processed for export by turning it into fish sauce and smoking it and drying it, and it was a delicacy around the Mediterranean world. And so what Antipas decides to do is decides to build a new capital in Galilee, abandons the capital in the former Sepphoris, and begins building a new capital at a place called Tiberias, right on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. That construction process begins in the year 19, when Jesus is about 19, I guess. Coming into his own as somebody who swings a hammer. That's, most historians now would say that's probably the reason why Jesus ended up migrating to the Sea of Galilee, was to get work rebuilding yet another imperial city. The primary function of Tiberias, I want to underline this again, was to regulate the fishing industry around the Sea of Galilee, putting it firmly under the control of Roman interests. The elites endeavored to control this product for export markets, as I said, which meant that the fish that was formerly caught in a sustainable fashion for local consumption was now increasingly processed into salt preserve for export, so that the traditional economy of local people was being completely turned on its head by these economic interests of empire. And the empire was moving in with its infrastructural projects such as roads, harbors, processing factories, all carried out by the Herodians. Remember, I told you, this story does not take place in Disneyland. And I keep saying that because you're thinking to yourself, how come I've never heard this? We've never heard it because it doesn't matter if Jesus is a helium balloon, what was going on in and around the Sea of Galilee. These are wonderful stories to romanticize. Jesus and the fishermen. So this brings us to the call of the first disciples in Mark. When recontextualized in the real world of first century Roman Palestine, this story has a lot to say about the political, economic, and social practices of Jesus and those who wish to follow him. You see, Jesus' encounter with fishermen at their work represents a scenario that is usually romanticized or trivialized in our churches. Right? Peter, the ruddy, weather-beaten, sunburnt Galilean fisherman. But in the very real world of first century Jewish Palestine, this is a very, very significant story. Because when Jesus came to Galilee, he walked right into an economic landscape that was undergoing dramatic and traumatic changes from the point of view of local peasant fishermen like Peter. The ancient sociologist Casey Hansen gives a compelling portrait of the political economy and the fishing industry during this period at the Sea of Galilee. All fishing had become state-regulated for the benefit of the urban elite. So back in the day, Peter and them could just get in their boat and go out and fish and catch enough for the day and a little bit for the village and come back. Now, you couldn't fish without a license. And what that means is that Greeks, Romans who had settled in Palestine following the military conquest, Jews who were connected with the Herodian family, everybody was deciding to profit from the fishing industry in one of two ways. First, they controlled all the sale of fishing leases, without which locals could not fish. These fishing rights and leases were normally awarded not to individuals, but to small family-owned, kinship-based fishing cooperatives, such as the brothers Simon and Andrew, or the Zebedee family that we meet in this text. Second, the elites taxed the fish product, taxed its processing, levied tolls on the transport of the product, and the local administrators handled royal leases, contracts, and taxes. So basically they were driving peasant fishermen out of business. They were taking what was formerly a local sustainable economy and structurally adjusting it for the benefit of the elite and export. Sound like any story you've heard about bananas or zinc or tomatoes. Now the Sea of Galilee, as you know, is a large freshwater lake about 7 miles wide and 13 miles long. The shore is dotted with villages connected with the local fishing industry, which was the most prosperous segment of the ancient economy. Due to its low-lying position in the Jordan Rift Valley surrounded by hills, the sea, of course, was prone to sudden violent storms, which is reflected in our gospel stories. Since 1970, archaeology has made it possible to literally map some 16 ancient harbors that were unknown until recently. The Jewish archaeologist Mendel Nun writes that most of the fishing villages pictured here were founded or rebuilt in the last centuries before the Christian era, which was probably also when the first harbors were built. So there are a lot of ruins from Roman times can still be seen around the lake, sophisticated hydraulic engineering facilities, networks of roads and bridges, public buildings. The Romans also developed maritime transport and were known for their superior construction of the harbors. So these kinds of places were the center of the fishing industry. And I just want to mention three in particular. Tiberias, I've already mentioned. That's the new capital of Herod on the Sea of Galilee, the imperial center now exerting Roman control over the. And I was in Tiberias a month ago, and you're standing there on the shore of Tiberias. You can see the whole lake. I mean, it's a very strategic place to build your projection of economic control. But here are a couple of other places that are sort of interesting. One is the town of Migdal, or Magdala, and the other is the village of Capernaum. Now, Migdal was a major harbor on the west shore of Galilee, north of Tiberias. Jesus may have sought work there in the ship repair yards. Its previous name, its Greek name, was Terrakeia, which means processed fishville. meaning that Magdala was the place where fish for export was processed in factories, which means you know who came from Migdal. Don't you? Jesus' buddy, Mary of Magdala, probably a refugee from the fish factories. The other village is really ground zero of the gospel story, and that is Capernaum. As an itinerant laborer, Jesus moved up and down the coast from harbor to harbor, and at some point appears in Capernaum, another major harbor on the north part of the lake. And it's here the gospel story reports that Jesus becomes familiar with the sons of Zebedee and Johann. And one of the really thrilling moments in my recent pilgrimage to Israel-Palestine was standing on the site they have now positively identified as Peter's house, because they know that there's been Christian veneration there since the 2nd century, and it's literally 10 yards from the water. It was a fishing hut. Jesus is portrayed encountering these fishermen around Capernaum, hardly surprising. These fishermen would have used 3 different methods. One was the method of the seine net, which is attached to shore on one end, while the other is pulled out into the lake in a circular path. Everything caught between the net and the shore is pulled in, and then a sorting process takes place. So there's an image in Matthew 13 where that's an image of judgment, where the fish are pulled in and you sort through the fish, the good fish and the bad fish. It's a fishing metaphor. A second kind of fishing was the cast net, in which fishermen would walk along the shore and the reeds in the shallow water and throw their nets at schools of fish and pull them up. That's what Peter and Andrew were doing when Jesus first saw them, we're told. This was the kind of fishing done in the daytime, and then the third type of fishing was done at nighttime, called the trammel net system, in which a series of complex nets weighted at the bottom with buoys on top, put out in a circle. Probably James and John were repairing this sort of net when Jesus encounters them. I hope, friends, this isn't boring to you. We talk a lot about the authority of the Bible, and the Bible is the Word of God. This actually is the terrain of the Bible. This is the real world that this story takes place in. Don't pay attention to the economic terrain here, then you don't have to pay attention to the economic terrain in our lives. It's almost that simple. And if you do, then you do. The economic changes taking place in the 20s of the 1st century functioned to marginalize and impoverish formerly self-sufficient native fishing families. Leases, taxes, and tolls were exorbitant. The fish upon which local people depended as a dietary staple was extracted for export. Elites looked down on local fishermen even as they depended upon their labor. The most shameful occupations are those which cater to our sensual pleasures, wrote the Roman poet Cicero pejoratively. Butchers, cooks, poultry raisers, and fishermen and fish sellers. The fisherman, attests one ancient Egyptian papyrus, is more miserable than any other profession. So much for the romanticized gospel moment. In fact, friends, when Jesus comes to the Sea of Galilee in the year 20 of the Common Era and finds these fishermen, he's walking into the equivalent of a modern sweatshop or diamond mine or cocoa plantation. It is into this very specific context that Jesus, himself a marginalized worker, steps in to begin his movement. You want to follow Jesus? Show up at a sweatshop. It's sort of like Gandhi, you know? It's a strategic choice to begin a movement among the poorest. So Gandhi attempted to mobilize the marginalized, the untouchable classes in India, in such campaigns such as his famous Salt March in 1930. And it's sort of like Martin Luther King's fateful decision to stand with the sanitation workers in Memphis in 1968. You see, that's how King got killed. He went to Memphis to stand with the garbage workers who were on strike and who no one else around the country would support. And Dr. King, you see, he wasn't about photo opportunities. He wasn't about building his career. He was about following Jesus. And he said, I'm going to go stand with those workers in Memphis. And once again, all his advisor says, Marty, don't do it. It's a trap. They're going to kill you, Marty. And he said, I got to go stand with them. And he tells the story of the Good Samaritan. And he says, the question isn't what's going to happen to me if I go stand with the garbage workers. The question is what's going to happen to them if I don't. And so he goes to Memphis. And there's a beautiful film. Jamie ought to find this film and show it, called At the River I Stand. And it's a history of the sanitation workers' strike in 1968 and King coming and the whole legacy of him being assassinated there. And there's this beautiful moment in the film when one of the old sanitation workers who's still alive, all of course whom were black and poor, he's interviewed his memories of the sanitation workers' strike, and he says, I remember when Dr. King came to town. We heard the news that Dr. King was coming to town. He said, for us it was like Jesus was coming to Memphis. Somebody cared enough to come be with us. Gandhi and King understood what Jesus knew, that great movements for social change must begin at the bottom, must begin at the margins. Change never, ever, ever trickles down from above. And I guess even it's a little bit sort of like the work that some of you do here in San Diego with the Interfaith Coalition for Worker Justice, part of the CLUE network, which is an attempt to stand with the people on the bottom of the economic pyramid here, to stand with low-wage workers, to work for a living wage, to work for fair and healthy work conditions. That's kind of choice that Jesus made by coming to the Sea of Galilee. Now we come to the final piece, and I want to draw your attention here for a minute to this statue. This is the mini version of it. Thank you, Jamie, for making this possible. You know where the big one is, right? Right out by the cafeteria. It's called the Cauldron. And it's bronze, and it's not going anywhere. It's pretty sturdy. And there you got Jesus looking on Peter. You know the story. Apparently, this is an important story to you Nazarenes, huh? Why? Y'all don't even fish. What's the deal with this thing? It's everywhere. It's on Jamie's shelf. It's out in front of the calf. What's the story here? I was kind of curious when I saw it yesterday. And Jesus said to them, follow me and I will make you fish for people. I think that's why it's there. Right? It's one of the most famous lines in gospel literature, beloved to you evangelicals, and has been traditionally interpreted in a decidedly non-economic way. Namely, that Jesus was calling these men to go save souls. Right? Would you agree that's how it's mostly been? In other words, Billy Graham is in hermeneutic control of this text. Well, I do believe Jesus was calling these fishermen to save souls. But we're missing Mark's real point because, like most Christians, we are functionally illiterate in the Hebrew Bible. So let us hear the echoes of no less than 4 prophetic oracles that employ versions of this very image. Jeremiah envisions God sending out for many fishermen in order to catch the wayward people of Israel, specifically those who have polluted the land with idols. I am sending for fishermen, says God, and they will catch you. And believe me, it's not to reward you. Or how about Prophet Amos in a similar vein, targeting the elite classes of Israel, whom he calls, rather indelicately, the cows of Bashan, warning that Yahweh is going to haul them away like sardines to judgment. The time is coming when they will take you away with hooks, every last one of you with fish hooks. Don't yell at me, I didn't write this stuff. Or the most clearly anti-imperial oracle found in Ezekiel's rant against Egypt's Pharaoh. As in the case of the Sea of Galilee, this oracle denounces the empire's delusion, in this case the Egyptian empire, that it owns all the water resources and all the fish in the sea. And God vows to yank the dragon of Egypt right out of the river, hook, line, and sinker, along with all the fish that the king claims exclusive rights to. And finally, the prophet Habakkuk, lamenting the way the Babylonian emperor overfishes, feeding on conquered peoples, cannibalizing the nations in the interests of empire. The Babylonian tyrant pulls the peoples all up with a fishhook, hauls them in with his throw net. He's happy when he catches them all. His success he offers sacrifices and burns incense to his dragnet. How long will he continue to fill and empty his throw net? Will he always destroy nations and spare none of them? In other words, this is a parody of empire hauling people away to oppression in their fishing nets. You see, friends, Jesus knew his Bible. I know you all have a high doctrine of the authority of the Bible. But the difference between a lot of us and Jesus is he actually knew his Bible. And not only that, he actually reenacted his Bible and recontextualized his Bible, brought it back to life in a new moment. He sought to embody these texts in his world. And so he says to these disciples, come on with me, let's go fishing. Now that's obviously an idiom they would understand, summoning working folk to join him in overturning the very highest structures of power and privilege in the world in order to restore God's justice to the poor. Or in modern parlance, come on, let's go catch some big fish. If Tiberias was ground zero in Herod's project of Romanizing the regional economy, then Capernaum up the coast, a village profoundly impacted by such policies, was the logical place to commence building a movement of resistance. Restless peasant fishermen had little to lose and everything to gain by overturning the status quo. With such rigid state control of their livelihood and the oppressive economics of export, and having fallen to the bottom of the economic hierarchy, it is hardly surprising that in Mark's story, the fishermen immediately respond. Of course they would. They got nothing to lose. They perceive Jesus as bringing good news to the poor. That is, to them. And we're told this story not once, but twice in succession in Mark 1:16-20 for emphasis. In antiquity, the demand to leave the workplace would have entailed more than the loss of economic security. It represented a rupture in the social fabric of the extended family. So Jesus' call to them is to an uncompromising break with business as usual. They drop their nets and follow him. But here's the interesting thing about the verb here. When it says they left their nets, the word in Greek is aphili, and it's used elsewhere in Mark and the Gospels to connote release from debt, forgiveness of sin, and liberation from prison. It is, in other words, a Jubilee term. As later articulated in the epilogue shown here in Mark 10 to the story of the call of the rich man who refuses to follow Jesus, the disciples say, hey, remember way back there in chapter 1? We left, aphiemi, everything and followed you. We declared a Jubilee. We embraced Sabbath economics. What about us? And Jesus' response is, truly I tell you, there is no one who has. That's Jesus' way of the conditional subjunctive, of sort of a marginal note in the text saying, your name goes here, question mark? Whosoever has. He isn't agreeing or disagreeing with whether Peter in fact has. The story will be a little ambiguous about that in the end. But Jesus issues this invitation to all of us to follow. And whosoever does leave house and family and fields for my sake and the sake of the gospel will receive 100-fold now, houses, family, field. That's the further articulation of Sabbath economics. If you give up your private anxiety and your private struggle against a system that's killing you and recommunitize everything into the beloved community and practice mutual aid, you will find your resources multiplying. I want to close with a sort of epilogue to this story. And that's the second call to discipleship in Mark. It's found in Mark chapter 2. Interestingly, this time it's not the fishermen who are called, but it's the tax collector. And what we know now is that Levi wasn't just a tax collector, he was a fishing lease seller. He was a street-level representative of the elite interests who were controlling the fishing market, and so he was the very person who was responsible for selling fishing leases to these peasant fishermen who used to be able to fish for free. How do you think the relationship between Peter and them was with Levi? Probably a little strained. Levi's tax office is in Capernaum. In addition to collecting taxes, he probably sold fishing rights, may have even supplied capital loans for certain fishermen to build nets or boats. He would naturally charge interest for these services. It's not for nothing that the subject of debt pops up throughout the Gospels repeatedly. Well, we're told that not only does Jesus call peasant fishermen, he also calls the people who are directly oppressing peasant fishermen. And the very next episode in Mark's Gospel is a party at Levi's crib. Debtors and debt collectors. Now, the only way, friends, I submit, in which these class enemies would have in fact shared table fellowship would have been if Levi's discipleship entailed a redistribution of his wealth and power. Jubilee, Sabbath economics. You think I'm making it up? Don't you remember the story of Zacchaeus at the end of Luke's Gospel? Zacchaeus wasn't just a street-level tax collector, he was the chief tax collector. And we're told very specifically that he responds to Jesus' invitation by vowing to redistribute half of his wealth. And you can sort of see Jesus' eyebrow go up, half. And he says, and I will make fourfold restitution as Torah teaches. If I have, Jesus is like, if you have defrauded anybody? The concrete discipleship of the elite involves very specific economic practices associated with their privilege. The gospel to the poor is, let's go catch some big fish. The gospel to the big fish is, let's renew the world by practicing Sabbath economics and knitting back the fabric of social relations. That is why the local authorities objected to the party at Levi's place. Jesus is starting a revolution in Galilee in which God's Jubilee justice is being realized. And Jesus' answer to their objection is sort of interesting. It points out the obvious. If you don't think the body politic is sick, you don't think it needs to be healed. If you think the system is working, then you're just going to sit back and enjoy the ride. But when you start hanging out with the poorest of the poor and the marginalized, you see that the system isn't working, and then you'll be looking for healing. Only those who understand the wound will pursue healing. Or as the bumper sticker likes to put it, if you think the system is working, ask somebody who isn't. Well, you know, history does teach us that we should never underestimate the power of a strategic meal. And I believe that Levi's fellowship at his pad was a strategic meal, threatening to overturn the social order way back in ancient Galilee. Just like when in 1960, 4 black college students walked into a Woolworth store in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat down at a whites-only lunch counter and waited to be served. A protest which within 3 days gained national attention, and soon sit-in demonstrations spread throughout the country. And within 6 months, 75,000 college students throughout the South were sitting in at lunch counters, starting the greatest social movement in the history of our nation. So to summarize, Mark's first discipleship call story describes a world in political, social, economic, and religious crisis. The tension of local disenfranchisement by imperial forces of globalization was intensified by the dramatic appearance of prophets who called their people to repentance, to turn around, not just individually, but to turn this entire social project around because it's headed toward disaster. That's what repentance means in the Bible. Mark's Jesus began building a movement of discipleship carefully and strategically with those at the very bottom of the socioeconomic ladder at that moment and in that place in history. If you are scandalized by that particularity, then you're going to miss the power of this story. But if it resonates with you, then your next step is to go with Jamie and folk to the border to start working with people who are struggling for minimum wage and to start seeing reality from the underside. Why? Not because it's the cool political thing to do, but because that's how we follow Jesus in the real world. The fact that fish are one of the earliest symbols of the Christian movement, I really like that. I guess it was meant to remind believers that discipleship was all about economics and all about God's challenge to empire on behalf of justice for the poor. Yeah, I was there. It was a real emotional moment for me to be in Topgod along the Sea of Galilee at the Church of the Loaves and Fishes, where this Byzantine 4th century mosaic still is on the floor underneath the altar, where tradition has it, Jesus broke the loaves and fishes. Why is it that the most ancient symbol of our tradition is a fish? It's an economic symbol. It was the symbol of economic survival and economic struggle and economic resistance. And it is the oldest symbol we have. Let's reconnect with the loaves and fishes. I think this means three things today for our churches. The gospel, number one, the gospel is supposed to represent good news for the poor. And we should be socially located accordingly. Secondly, we need to be discerning what it means to go after big fish today in our globalizing economy. And thirdly, we are called to reach out both to victims and oppressors. That's restorative justice, to build celebrative community across social boundaries based upon real distribution of wealth and power. Outside you'll see a couple of booklets we've produced about both more sort of biblical vision and practical meaning today of this term Sabbath economics, which you may not have heard until this week, and I invite you to go there and look a little bit more at it. I want to let Dr. King have the last word. As you know, King was killed in Memphis, and if you go to Memphis today to the Lorraine Motel where he was cut down, you'll see that really one of the wonderful things in this country, which is the National Civil Rights Museum, which has been built right in the motel. And standing under the balcony where King was cut down is this memorial stone. And all it says, as you can see, is a simple quotation from Genesis 37. This is, of course, the story of Joseph and his brothers. And it says, they said to one another, "Behold, here comes the dreamer. Let us kill him and see what becomes of his dream." You know, every time I go there, and I've been there 4 or 5 times, I just burst into tears when I see it. Because it stands like an unresolved chord over our nation and our church. What will become? Not just of King's dream, but even more deeply of God's dream. What will become of it? The prophets are slain. Dr. King, April 4th. Giuliano, April 4th. And so many others. King ended his Riverside speech with these words, "The choice is ours. And though we might prefer it otherwise, we must choose in this crucial moment of human history." You know, Dr. King was a preacher, and he couldn't end without an altar call. And I want to leave you with Dr. King's altar call, the call of conscience from his epitaph, that we all might figure out ways to embrace the real dream of God in the real world and follow Jesus to work with the poor and to work for justice. That's all I got. Thank you.